Hey, Alicia Novin here. This video is going to be geared more towards managers and leaders in an agile environment, and I'm going to be covering 5 things that you might not be doing correctly or that are more nuanced and might have some factors that you want to consider. Here we go. The thing I love about Agile is that it is incredibly common sense. And that actually makes it a little challenging at times because we can often overcomplicate things and overanalyze how we need to do things. And so the things that I want to cover are really going to be about getting things back to basics and making sure that we're thinking through them in an agile mindset. So here we go with number 1. Let's start with the daily stand-up. If your stand-up meeting started at 15 minutes, but now it's about 45 minutes or getting close to an hour, you're probably doing some key things incorrectly in that stand-up meeting. And you can start resolving that by first asking a very important question, which is, what is the main purpose of the stand-up? And the answer should never be that it's for the manager to get a status update on the overall progress of the project. That's the wrong approach. The daily stand-up is a meeting that is meant to coordinate and organize and synchronize the individual team members that contribute to the daily tasks on that Kanban board. And that's why it's run every single day. So the next thing that you should be asking yourself would be, what are the things that we talk about in that stand-up meeting when it's geared around the individuals? And one important thing is to ask yourself, how up to date is your Kanban board? Because you never want to be getting it up to date in the stand-up. If you're doing that, you're wasting a lot of time. Have people update the cards and update what column they might be in real time and as it happens. That way you're not having to do that in the stand-up meeting, and you can speak to the item as they exist on the board. And you don't need to state the obvious because the board already reflects the current state of things. That way you can focus on one of the most important parts of the stand-up, which is about the blockers and the impediments. Now, that gets to the third thing, which is, how do you actually tackle those problems, those impediments that people are raising? You want to hear from everybody first before you do any problem solving. Because if you try to problem solve that very first thing that someone raises, you're prioritizing it over something that might be far more urgent that you've yet to hear about. So get through everyone and make note of all the problems, and then tackle the problems in order of urgency at the end of your stand-up meeting. Finally, one of the things that is always worth considering would be, who are all the individuals that contribute to moving those items forward? And obviously the development team is really important to that, but sometimes there are non-coders that should be a part of that meeting. And if you can make it a 15-minute obligation, it's not that big of an ask, and it might move things along faster. So maybe they're in a non-technical role, but they're integral to one of the cards that are on the board, or integral to the overall process. They should be part of that meeting. They don't need to be an active speaker, but they're there in case something arises that needs them to contribute and provide their feedback on. When you have them as part of that meeting, it makes things move a lot faster, and you're not delaying getting that information surfaced sooner. So think about who are the right people that should be in that meeting. Let's talk about fleshing out business requirements for features and the kind of documentation that you might need on a card. Again, think back to the fact that Agile is all about minimizing and cutting out unnecessary work, which means that if you can convey information or convey a concept in a very simple way, take that approach. You don't always need formalized documentation. And in fact, if formalized documentation adds more work and doesn't provide anything additional in terms of value, you should not do it at all. And so one thing that I'm a big fan of is just whiteboarding things and taking a picture of that whiteboard, uploading it as an attachment to the card. You don't need to then go and formalize it in terms of some kind of document, because the second you produce another document that captures the requirements, you're going to always have to maintain that document, or otherwise it'll just fall out of date and then not become relevant. And so why carry that burden? And that gets me to a whole other concept that I think is really important to cover, which is about, where do user stories ultimately end and acceptance criteria begin? Because both of them capture roughly the same thing, and there's some important overlap there. And something that I heard recently from one of my Agile heroes, Mike Cohn, is about how he approaches user stories, which is really that if you write a good user story, it contains a lot of your acceptance criteria. There might be some nuance and some additional details that you'll want to capture separately in the acceptance criteria, but a well-defined user story will oftentimes state what that acceptance criteria is so that everyone knows what they need to build against. So again, take that agile common sense approach and don't overcomplicate it by adding all of this additional overhead of documentation or formalized approaches. I want to make two important points about estimating. The first one is estimates should be a reflection of the level of effort something will take and not the length of time. Obviously, one person estimating how long something will take can be fairly inaccurate. And when you add more voices to that, when you add more people estimating based on time, you're going to have inaccuracies and inconsistencies because people have different levels of experience, different skill sets, and estimating how long something will take will just not be accurate. And then when you try to size your sprint or your iteration based off of time, you're going to have to then lock people into cards that they estimated because that way you want it to be accurate and you don't want it to have an inaccurate velocity. But that's not an agile approach. You don't want to lock people into cards before they even start on it, because then if someone else is free and that person's busy, they're going to sit on their hands. And the agile approach is having you always give work to whoever can take it on. When you size things based off of effort, it's a lot more of an interesting question and you produce more consistent results, because while two people don't agree necessarily on time, they will agree on the level of effort, especially given a good reference point. Regardless of their skill set, people will say that yes, that card, that user story is twice as difficult as this reference point. And so you can use that when you're defining things in terms of your story points or your, if you're doing t-shirt sizing, you can use that as a way to reflect the level of effort. And you don't want to cheat it by saying that a t-shirt size of medium is going to be a 4 to 8 hour task, because again, that level of effort gets really cheated into becoming an estimation of time. So instead, make your iteration about effort and allow a certain amount of effort per iteration, and you'll find that you'll have a lot more consistent results that way. Now, the second thing is about whether or not you should estimate bugs. And really the answer there is you shouldn't, because bugs are defects in code that has already been written and it's work that you've already taken credit for. So in terms of your velocity, if you start estimating bugs and you track bugs against your velocity, you're kind of double dipping because you're taking credit twice for work that you didn't do correctly the first time. And that'll impact the quality or the reliability of your velocity. So instead, when you have a bug, just do the bug as part of the normal course of work, because it's going to have to get done one way or the other, and you don't want to take credit for that work twice. The definition of done is like a contract. It makes sure that everyone is consistent when they talk about what done means. And if you don't have a very clear definition of done, you want to make sure you tackle that in your next retrospective. Because that way, when cards move from one column to the next, everyone will know that it's met that same set of criteria, and you don't get into these weird terms where people say, oh, that's done and that's done. That doesn't really mean a whole lot. But when you say this is what done means for us, it passes all these unit tests, it's been executed in this environment, or whatever else you might add to that, that way you have a lot of consistency as cards move forward. Now, the other thing is that a lot of circumstances might change over the course of a project, and sometimes the types of cards or the features that create user stories might be different, and so you want to make sure you're updating your definition of done pretty regularly. You don't always have to wait for a retrospective. You can do it maybe even at the tail end of your stand-up if you have the time, but basically you want to make sure that you're consistently evaluating whether or not that definition of done needs to be updated. I'm going to wrap up on a point that I kind of made at the beginning, which is really about following process. Process is really helpful, but you don't want process to rule everything. Agile is really good at focusing on what matters most, and that is delivering value to your customers. And sometimes your process might have you go down a road that is a lot more time consuming or has not been fully updated to meet the current circumstances. And so if you find that there's nuance that is making your process slow down, don't follow the process. Follow what delivers value to your customers. The worst thing that you can do is just always follow the process because that's what the process says you need to do. Instead, be critical, be agile, and allow yourself to adapt to the circumstances. Discuss it as a group, communicate openly and transparently, and that way you'll make sure that everything that you're working on is always focused on value and not process. So whether you're doing Kanban, which is my favorite, or Scrum, or some kind of mishmash of the two, these are 5 different things that you want to be super critical about on your own team. Again, Agile is not necessarily about a strict process, but it's about a way of thinking. And so you always want to make sure you're evaluating and focused on value. If you found these things helpful, if you have any comments or questions, send them my way. And otherwise, I hope you'll check out a podcast that I'm doing called Increments, which focuses more on our growth as coders in the industry. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You'll also find it at increments.dev. Thanks a lot.